Hey guys, tonight we set sail down a river you've definitely heard of, the Nile. A ribbon of green threading through endless sand, carrying life where there should only be death. You drift along its calm surface, papyrus reeds swaying like curious listeners, and you watch as the very first human footprints press into the wet banks. This isn't the kind of story where you slay dragons or win treasure. You're more likely to be gnawed on by mosquitoes, stumble into hippos the size of compact cars, or accidentally invent farming by dropping seeds. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this era longer than a week, but that's part of the fun. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and the time right now. I want to know if you're listening at 3 a.m. in your kitchen with a snack, or dozing off after work. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first settlers arrived thousands of years before pyramids, before pharaohs, before anyone even knew how to chisel stone into shape. Picture yourself wandering into this strange landscape. To your left, a strip of fertile soil damp with river silt. To your right, dry desert stretching to infinity. People hug the riverbanks because stepping too far from the Nile is like unplugging your life support. Every plant, every fish, every sip of water comes from that one artery. You watch families set up tiny huts of reeds. Someone drops a seed, maybe barley or emmer wheat, into the moist soil. A season later, it sprouts. Farming doesn't arrive all at once. It sneaks in gradually, a side gig next to fishing and hunting gazelles. Historians still argue whether the earliest Egyptians invented agriculture on their own or borrowed the idea from neighbors in the Fertile Crescent. Either way, you're standing at the dawn of something big: bread, beer, and the first excuse for taxes. Life here is equal parts paradise and nightmare. Paradise, the Nile floods every year, coating the fields with rich black silt. Nightmare, sometimes the flood is stingy, sometimes it's a raging monster that sweeps away huts. The people don't complain, they tell stories. They whisper that the river is a gift from gods, not random water. As you trail behind one of these families, you see quirky traditions sprouting. A fisherman offers a prayer not to a generic river spirit, but to a crocodile-headed deity that looks like he leapt straight out of a heavy metal album cover. That god, Sobek, promises protection if you show respect. Crocodiles, by the way, lurk just under the surface. One wrong move and chomp, you're a snack. That little prayer suddenly makes perfect sense. By night, you sit around a fire. Children poke the embers, and elders hum lullabies you'll never understand. In their minds, spirits fill the world. Spirits of sky, of soil, of the glowing sun that seems to bake them alive by noon. It's not a formal religion yet, but the seeds of Egyptian mythology are already here. Your modern brain can't help but compare. They're just making do with mud huts, but they're also shaping the rhythm of civilization. A quirky tidbit: archaeologists found evidence of early beer production this far back. Yes, humanity invented booze practically as soon as farming. It wasn't frothy golden lager, but a thick, porridge-like drink. You sip it, pretending you enjoy it, and try not to gag. The nights stretch long. You lie on woven mats, staring at stars that blaze brighter than any city dweller could imagine. No Netflix, no Wi-Fi, just the Milky Way smeared across the heavens. Someone points up, tracing constellations with their finger. Were they already mapping gods into the sky? Historians still argue whether these early star watchers were proto-astronomers or just daydreamers with sand in their eyes. Either way, it's the beginning of Egypt's obsession with the heavens. Day by day, these riverside families grow into villages. Villages grow into small chiefdoms. Chiefs start competing. Whose hut is taller? Whose harvest is richer? Whose cattle fatter? You trail behind, amused, because nothing has changed in human nature. Even 8,000 years ago, it's the same humble bragging contest you see on Instagram, just with goats instead of luxury cars. The Nile keeps dictating everything. It's both generous and cruel, a god and a tyrant. People learn its moods like you'd learn the mood swings of a boss. They start tracking the flood cycle with notched sticks, realizing it's connected to the stars above. Out of boredom or brilliance, they're inventing the first calendars. You realize you're watching one of humanity's earliest attempts to wrestle chaos into order. The settlements smell of smoke, fish, and sweat. Children chase each other with sticks. Women pound grain into flour. Men drag nets from the water, heavy with catfish. Cats appear, sneaky little freeloaders, lured by rodents raiding grain stores. Instead of chasing them off, families let them stay. You grin, because the world's most internet-famous pet just earned its first spot on the payroll. Every so often, a quarrel breaks out between neighboring groups. Maybe someone stole cattle. Maybe someone claimed the better stretch of riverbank. Weapons are still basic, clubs, spears tipped with stone. But already you see that tension bubbling. You feel it. One day, these squabbles will scale up into kingdoms, armies, and dynasties. But for now, life remains simple. Sun rises, Nile floods, grain grows, bread bakes. The cycle repeats, endlessly reliable, endlessly fragile. You lean back into the river breeze, lulled by the rhythm of water against reeds. It's boring in a way that's almost hypnotic, the perfect background noise to fall asleep to. And yet, hidden in that boredom, the entire future of Egyptian civilization is quietly germinating. You drift further downstream, and the huts you saw earlier have begun sprouting into something larger. Villages cluster like beads along the Nile, and each one hums, with its own rhythm. Chickens cluck, goats bleat, children laugh in the dust, and somewhere a chieftain is yelling because his neighbors dared to build their granary taller than his. Rivalry is alive and well. These are no longer just families scratching the earth for food. They're tribes, and every tribe wants to be top dog. You trail behind one of these chiefs as he struts through his settlement. He's got the biggest hut, the fattest cows, and followers who glare at anyone daring to look at him the wrong way. His power is fragile, though. Without loyalty, he's just another guy in a skirt trying to act important. So what does he do? He tells a story. He says the gods gave him special favor, that the Nile listens to him. Does the river actually care? Of course not. It's just water, indifferent as ever. But people believe it, because believing feels safer than facing randomness. As generations pass, chiefs become kings, kings become conquerors, and suddenly the patchwork of little villages is stitching itself into kingdoms. Historians still argue whether this happened peacefully through alliances or violently through raids and battles. Either way, you watch the tug-of-war unfold. In the north, the delta, the land fans out into a marshy maze, and people build light boats to slip through it. In the south, the valley, the Nile slices between cliffs, and villages cling tightly to its banks. Two cultures form, Lower Egypt in the north, Upper Egypt in the south. The names feel backward to you because of the river's flow, but to them it makes perfect sense. Eventually, competition turns into destiny. Around 3100 BCE, one figure emerges from the haze of myth and half-remembered tales, Narmer, sometimes called Menes. You squint at an ancient ceremonial palette, carved in stone, showing him wearing both crowns, the red of Lower Egypt, the white of Upper Egypt. He smashes rivals with a mace in one hand, calmly leading a parade of captives with the other. Is it propaganda? Almost certainly. Historians still argue whether Narmer was truly the first unifier, or just the one who got the best PR team. But the point stands. Egypt has found its first pharaoh. You stand at his side as he gazes over a land newly stitched together. Suddenly, the Nile isn't just a river. It's a backbone for a whole kingdom. You notice something quirky here. Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were gods in training. Ordinary humans need sunscreen. Pharaohs need temples. Ordinary chiefs might boast about cows. Pharaohs boast about controlling the sun. That's quite a career jump. The people don't seem to mind. In fact, they like it. A single ruler means fewer random raids, more predictable harvests, and maybe even a little stability. Taxes appear, of course, because some things never change. You hand over a share of your grain, grumbling, while officials tally everything on clay tablets. It's the world's earliest version of the IRS, and yes, It's already annoying. Narmer's court buzzes with energy. Officials scurry. Scribes practice the art of hieroglyphs, and soldiers polish copper-tipped spears. You feel like you've walked into a startup before it goes public. Chaotic, ambitious. Everyone convinced they're changing history. And in a way, they are. Because this is the start of Dynasty 1, and dynasties are Egypt's favorite hobby for the next 3,000 years. Still, unification isn't smooth sailing. The Delta resents being bossed around by Southerners, and Southerners don't trust the marsh dwellers up north. Narmer's solution? Build a brand new capital halfway between. A place called Memphis. You wander its dusty streets, smelling fresh plaster and watching workers haul bricks. It's strategic, right at the choke point of the Nile, and it screams, I control both worlds now. Religious traditions follow close behind. The pharaoh isn't just a ruler. He's a living bridge between gods and people. Priests craft elaborate rituals to reinforce the idea. You slip into a temple where incense thickens the air. Priests chant over offerings of bread and beer, and statues glimmer in the candlelight. Do the gods actually eat? Of course not. But the priests do later, so it's a win-win. Meanwhile, everyday folks keep living much as before. They plow, they fish. They gossip about how weird their neighbors are. What changes is the sense of belonging. Suddenly, you're not just from that village by the reeds. You're an Egyptian. The Nile is your highway, your lifeline, and your badge of identity. That kind of unity is powerful. It's the glue that lets people dream bigger. But under the surface, cracks are already forming. Pharaohs need loyalty, and loyalty isn't free. They hand out land. They reward allies. They keep a close eye on rivals. You sense the balancing act. Too much generosity, and the state goes broke. Too much greed, and rebellion bubbles up. It's the eternal dilemma of rulers everywhere. Still, as you lie down on the banks one evening, watching stars twinkle over this newborn kingdom, you can't help but marvel. From scattered huts to a united land in just a few centuries. That's fast in ancient terms. Egypt is no longer a cluster of tribes. It's a kingdom, with ambition carved into every stone and legend whispering from every reed. And you know that from here, the story is only going to get grander and stranger. The sun rises over Memphis, and you find yourself in a world that feels both familiar and alien. Farmers are already trudging into the fields. Priests are muttering their morning chants, and officials are sharpening their reed pens. But today, your gaze is pulled away from the ordinary towards something massive, literally massive. The age of pyramids is beginning, and you're about to watch humans build mountains out of stone with nothing but sweat, rope, and stubbornness. The idea doesn't start with pyramids, though. It begins smaller, mastabas those low, rectangular tombs, where early kings and elites bury themselves with all their stuff. Think of them like oversized Lego bricks stacked in the desert. At first, they're humble enough, but kings are never content with humble. One day, someone says, what if we stack mastabas on top of each other? And boom, you've got the Step Pyramid of Djoser, designed by Imhotep, the world's first celebrity architect. You lean against a sun-warmed block, squinting at the geometric layers, rising like a staircase to heaven. People call Imhotep a genius, and later, some will literally worship him as a god. That's what happens when your resume reads, invented the pyramid. From there, things escalate. Kings, now properly called pharaohs, are obsessed with proving that their divine power can outlast death. Nothing says, I'm eternal, like a giant triangle visible from miles away. You watch as the desert outside Memphis transforms into a construction zone. Thousands of workers swarm like ants, dragging limestone blocks with sledges across slick mud paths. Someone jokes that they should invent the wheel, but nah, they're perfectly fine with brute force and clever tricks. The Giza Plateau rises before your eyes, a landscape of ambition. Khufu, a pharaoh with an ego big enough to need its own postal code, orders the Great Pyramid. You stand at the base, craning your neck until it hurts, realizing this thing once soared nearly 480 feet tall. Forget skyscrapers. This was the tallest building in the world for almost 4,000 years. Historians still argue exactly how they built it. Ramps, spirals, alien subcontractors with laser levels? Nobody agrees. But here it stands, an eternal triangle against the sky, daring time to knock it down. Life around the site is surprisingly lively. Workers camp in bustling villages, not miserable slaves as Hollywood likes to show, but mostly free laborers, farmers off-season, and craftsmen. They're paid in bread, beer, and the occasional side of meat. You sip the beer, still thick and porridge-y, and wonder how anyone gets through a 12-hour shift in the desert without collapsing. Somehow they do. In fact, archaeologists have found evidence of decent medical care. Broken bones healed neatly, workers fed well. Sure, it's grueling, but it's also a giant national project. Half devotion, half job security. A quirky tidbit: graffiti scratched inside the pyramids includes team names like the Drunkards of Menkaure and the Friends of Khufu. Turns out even in the afterlife business, people love silly workplace nicknames. Imagine carving stone in the blazing sun while proudly wearing your drunkard's badge of honor. Inside the pyramid, narrow passages twist into burial chambers where treasure, furniture, and even board games are tucked alongside the pharaoh's body. You trail through one tunnel, claustrophobic, hearing your heartbeat echo off limestone walls. The air smells of dust and eternity. Every object you pass is meant to help the king live forever in the afterlife. You can't help but smirk. Eternity sounds exhausting. Back outside, priests oversee rituals, chanting to Ra, the sun god, who rides his fiery boat across the sky each day. You realize pyramids are not just tombs, they're solar engines, cosmic staircases for pharaohs to blast off and join Ra's eternal crew. Did the afterlife actually work that way? Historians still argue, but the symbolism is undeniable. Meanwhile, ordinary Egyptians marvel and grumble. They bow when the pharaoh's procession passes, but later at dinner, they joke about the absurd size of these tombs. Still, there's pride in it too. Imagine being a farmer who points at Giza and says, "See that stone halfway up? I hauled it." It's national identity carved into stone. Of course, not every pyramid turns out perfect. You shuffle past the bent pyramid of Sneferu, its slope awkwardly changing angle halfway up, like a kid gave up on geometry. Nearby is the Red Pyramid, smoother and more stable, the real prototype for Giza. Even pharaohs have their learning curve, trial, error, and very expensive mistakes in limestone. As you lie back in the sand, gazing up at the Great Pyramid silhouetted against the setting sun, you realize you're watching the human will to outdo death itself. Kings die, but stone remains. Workers sweat, but memory endures. And whether you find it awe-inspiring or hilariously over the top, the age of pyramids has set the tone for everything Egypt will ever be. Dramatic, divine, and larger than life. You drift away from the shadow of pyramids, letting the desert heat soften into evening. Yet the air doesn't stay quiet for long, because in Egypt, gods are everywhere, crowding the landscape like noisy neighbors who never move out. If the pyramids were monuments to ambition, the temples and myths you step into now are monuments to belief, imagination, and the occasional crocodile in a bad mood. You wander through a temple courtyard, incense thick enough to sting your nose. Priests bustle about, carrying trays of bread, beer, and roasted goose, not for people, but for statues. The statues don't actually eat, of course, but the priests will later, which feels like the world's earliest catering scam. Still, nobody questions it. The statues aren't just stone, they're vessels. The god Ra, or Isis, or Sobek supposedly dwells in them. And you wouldn't dare offend a divine landlord. Egypt's gods aren't shy about diversity. The pantheon sprawls with more personalities than a reality TV show. Ra, the blazing sun god, rides his fiery boat across the sky each day, then battles chaos serpent Apophis in the underworld at night. Osiris, the green-skinned king of the dead, judges your soul on a cosmic scale against the feather of truth. Isis, his devoted wife, works literal magic to reassemble his chopped-up body, a myth so dramatic it makes soap operas look tame. And then there's Anubis, jackal-headed embalmer, who silently watches while priests mummify bodies. You get the feeling he'd be the guy at a party who never laughs, but always knows where the snacks are. Quirky tidbit: cats aren't just useful rodent catchers anymore. They've gone full divine. Batet, the cat-headed goddess, Purrs her way into temples. People keep little cat statues for luck, and eventually, some households even mummify their pets. Imagine explaining that to your neighbors. Oh yes, this is Whiskers. He's sacred. Don't trip over him. Historians still argue whether Egyptian religion was primarily about cosmic order, keeping the sun rising and Nile flooding, or more about political theater, reinforcing Pharaoh's divine status. Probably both. You see it firsthand. Pharaohs appear in carvings smiting enemies under the gaze of Horus, their falcon god buddy. It's not just art, it's propaganda. I'm not just your king. I'm literally chosen by heaven. Try arguing with that. The myths swirl together, stories told under starlight. Children lean close to hear how Nut, the sky goddess, swallows the sun at night and gives birth to it each morning. Farmers nod knowingly. It explains why the world doesn't fall apart. And honestly, it's a better bedtime story than the earth just rotates. Walking deeper into the temple, you notice every wall carved with hieroglyphs. Some show offerings, others endless prayers to keep the gods appeased. Priests chant, their voices blending with the flicker of torchlight. The mood is hypnotic, almost ASMR before microphones. You feel your own eyelids droop. The whole ritual seems designed not just to honor gods, but to lull humans into believing everything's under control. Not that the gods themselves always behave. The myths describe feuds, betrayals, and cosmic temper tantrums. Once, Ra sends out his eye, a fiery goddess named Sekhmet, to punish humanity for disobedience. She goes a little too far, nearly wiping everyone out, until Ra tricks her, with beard dyed red, to look like blood. She drinks it, gets tipsy, and calms down. Basically, the world was saved by an ancient keg party. The ordinary Egyptians you pass weave these myths into daily life. Farmers pray to Hapi, the spirit of the Nile, hoping for gentle floods. Mothers whisper to Tarit, the hippo goddess of childbirth, to guard their babies. Even the smallest amulet carved in faience carries a plea. Protect my health, protect my harvest, protect my sleep. You realize you're in a culture where nothing is too small for divine attention. Every hiccup, every sneeze, every stray shadow has a god assigned to it. And yet, beneath the pageantry, there's order. The Egyptians call it Ma'at, the principle of balance, truth, and justice. It's not just cosmic fluff, it's law, morality, and the glue of society. Pharaohs boast about upholding Ma'at, judges wait in court, and even in the afterlife, your soul is measured against it. You picture a giant cosmic scale, your heart on one side, a feather on the other. If your heart's heavier, stuffed with lies, cruelty, or maybe too many stolen beers, Ammit, a crocodile lion hippo chimera, eats you. End of story. As you step back into the desert night, the temple lights glow behind you like stars caught on earth. The air smells of smoke, lotus blossoms, and faint sweat. You glance at the Nile, moonlight rippling over its surface, and you can almost believe the gods are real, riding their boats just beyond sight. Whether they truly exist or not, you realize something profound. Belief is power. And in Egypt, gods aren't just ideas. They're the architecture of society, the scaffolding of every law, every pyramid, every heartbeat. The temples and myths hum in the background as you wander away from priests and pharaohs, into the alleys where ordinary Egyptians actually live. It's here that the kingdom breathes. The dusty courtyards, smoky kitchens, and crowded marketplaces, where life is equal parts dull and fascinating. Forget golden sarcophagi and giant statues. Most people in Egypt are busy just making sure there's bread on the table and beer in the jug. You step into a typical mud brick house. It's small, cool, and dark, built to survive the relentless heat. A mother kneads dough while a child spins around her legs, chasing a goose that clearly doesn't want to be caught. The smell of baking bread clings to the air, earthy and warm. Bread is life here. Dense loaves of emmer wheat, sometimes flavored with dates or honey if you're lucky. You bite into a piece and immediately crunch on sand, because grinding grain with stone tools leaves grit mixed in. Egyptians were basically chewing sandpaper, which explains why their teeth wore down to nubs. Next door, a man is brewing beer in clay jars. It's thick, frothy, and looks suspiciously like oatmeal soup. You try it, surprise. It's sour but strangely refreshing. Perfect after a hot day in the fields. Beer is everyone's drink, even for kids. Safer than water, cheap, and filling. You smile, realizing you're sipping the original working-class beverage. Somewhere, an ancestor of the modern pub is nodding in approval. Markets buzz with barter. Farmers haul baskets of onions, fish, and figs, while artisans show off linen tunics or carved trinkets. A scribe sits smugly at his booth, offering to write contracts or love letters for a fee, of course. Being able to read hieroglyphs is like owning the Wi-Fi password. Only a few have it, and everyone else is desperate to borrow. Historians still argue whether scribes were admired professionals or just insufferable know-it-alls. Either way, they're essential to the machinery of Egypt. Quirky tidbit: makeup isn't just for women. You pass a group of men carefully applying green malachite eyeliner around their eyes. Sure, it looks stylish, but they'll tell you it also wards off infections and the evil eye. Plus, it keeps the glare of the desert sun down. A mix of health hack and fashion statement. You can't help but think of it as the world's first pair of Ray-Bans. Children dart between stalls, tossing hoops, wrestling in the dust, or chasing little balls. Toy dolls carved from wood or stuffed with cloth dangle from market stalls. Laughter echoes everywhere. It turns out ancient childhood isn't so different from now, except without the Wi-Fi tantrums. Cats patrol the grain sacks, sleek and aloof, earning their keep by keeping rats away. You grin at one stretching lazily, looking exactly like your neighbor's cat back home. Beyond the markets, you stroll into the fields. Farmers bend under the sun, driving wooden plows pulled by oxen. They move with a rhythm tuned to the Nile cycle. Flood, plant, harvest, repeat. Life is predictable, but precarious. One bad flood, too low or too high, and everything collapses. People whisper prayers to Happy, the Nile spirit, before casting seeds, because survival isn't guaranteed. Back in the village, artisans work in shaded workshops. Potters spin clay on wheels, basket weavers knot reeds into sturdy containers, and carpenters carve beds or stools. Metal workers heat copper until it glows, hammering it into tools. The air rings with clinks and thuds, the heartbeat of an economy powered by skilled hands. You run your fingers over a linen tunic, light, breathable, and shockingly soft. Fashion may be simple, but it's elegant. White linen is the uniform of Egypt, practical in the heat and symbolic of purity. Evenings are quieter. Families gather around oil lamps, their flickering light painting shadows on the walls. Someone strums a lute, someone else claps rhythm, and voices rise in psalm. You close your eyes, lulled by the simple music. The Nile breeze drifts in, cool against your skin, carrying the smell of lotus flowers. Still, not everything is peaceful. Taxes press hard, and overseers check the granaries with suspicious eyes. Rumors of corrupt officials spread like wildfire. Some folks grumble that the pharaohs' project swallowed too much grain, leaving little for villages. You hear it in whispers over bread. Loyalty is easier when your stomach is full. Yet pride still shines through. When villagers talk about pyramids or temples, they point out their own contribution. My uncle hauled stone for that wall. My cousin baked bread for the workers. Egypt may be ruled from above, but it's built from below. As you settle on a rooftop to watch the stars, you notice how daily life here blends survival, faith, and play into one seamless rhythm. Nothing is glamorous, nothing is easy, but everything feels connected. To the river, to the gods, to each other. You yawn, realizing that in the end, ordinary Egyptian life is a lot like yours. Work, food, family, sleep, repeat. It's just wrapped in linen and dust instead of denim and Wi-Fi. The stars fade, and the Nile greets you with another golden dawn. But something in the air feels heavier now. The laughter of markets, the steady rhythm of farming, even the majesty of pyramids, it all begins to crack. You sense unease trickling through the kingdom, like sand slipping into shoes. The old kingdom, that grand age of pyramids and divine kingship, is teetering. You're about to watch Egypt's first great collapse, and it isn't pretty. At first, it seems subtle. Harvests grow thinner. The Nile, once reliable as clockwork, misses its beat. One year the flood is too weak, leaving the fields thirsty. The next year it's too strong, drowning seeds and huts alike. Farmers mutter that the gods are displeased, while priests double the incense offerings. Historians still argue whether this instability was caused by climate shifts or just plain bad luck. Either way, when the Nile falters, Egypt falters. Meanwhile, pharaohs lose their shine. The kings after Khufu and his mighty pyramid don't inspire the same awe. Their tombs shrink, their projects falter, their treasuries run dry. You wander into a half-finished pyramid, blocks abandoned mid-haul, workers long gone. The grandeur is gone, and what's left is silence and sand. Pharaoh's divine image cracks when people realize he can't even keep the river in line. Local governors, nomarchs, smell opportunity. Out in the provinces, far from the capital, they tighten control, hoard resources, and build their own tombs as if daring the pharaoh to stop them. You pass one of these provincial tombs, its walls proudly declaring loyalty to the king, while its sheer size screams independence. It's like a manager who still copies the boss on emails, but makes all the real decisions himself. Quirky tidbit: even as things collapse, artistry thrives. Coffin decorations explode in creativity. Instead of relying on expensive pyramids, families pour their resources into painted coffins covered with spells and protective images. You trail your hand across one such coffin, its colors still vibrant. Ordinary Egyptians now dream of the afterlife with the same optimism kings once claimed as their exclusive privilege. Collapse, it seems, makes people inventive. But hunger gnaws deeper. Granaries run low, and famine shadows villages. You stumble through a marketplace where stalls sit empty. Families trade scraps of cloth for handfuls of grain, and children's laughter fades into cries. Some texts from this period describe cannibalism, though historians still argue whether that's literal or just poetic exaggeration. Either way, it paints a grim picture. The land that once seemed blessed by the gods feels abandoned. In this chaos, Egypt fractures. Small warlords rise, carving territories out of what used to be a unified kingdom. Nomarchs declare themselves local kings, ruling from provincial strongholds. You stand at the edge of one such skirmish, dust clouds rising, spears clashing, oxen bellowing as soldiers stumble through the sand. There's no epic battle here, no noble cause, just desperate grabs for survival and scraps of power. Yet not everything is despair. Some villages adapt cleverly. Farmers dig new canals, experimenting with water storage. Families barter skills more than goods. I'll weave your linen if you share your harvest. Communities knit tighter at the ground level even as the grand political fabric unravels. You realize survival in Egypt has always been local first, national second. Religion shifts too. People no longer see the pharaoh as the all-powerful link to the gods, because clearly he's dropping the ball. Instead, they look to Osiris, the god of the dead, whose myth of death and rebirth feels like hope in dark times. Suddenly, Osiris isn't just a royal protector, he's everyone's protector. You hear peasants whisper prayers, not for prosperity, but for survival after death. It's a quiet revolution of faith. Walking through the ruins of an unfinished pyramid, you notice graffiti scratched on the stone, rough prayers, complaints, even doodles. Ordinary voices breaking through official silence. They didn't expect historians to read them thousands of years later. But here you are, listening to their exhaustion. It feels strangely modern, like scrolling through frustrated social media posts. Eventually, even memory fades. Pharaohs of this weakened era barely register in later histories. Their names crumble, their legacies vanish. What survives are whispers of famine, of rebellion, of people desperate for stability. And as you lie down in the dust beside the Nile, you sense the strange rhythm of Egypt's story. Rise, glory, collapse, repeat. The old kingdom's fall isn't the end, it's a pause. Egypt is too stubborn, too resourceful, to stay broken forever. But in this moment, as the desert wind whistles through abandoned quarries, you feel the emptiness of a once great civilization gasping for breath. The sun sets low, and Egypt's silence feels heavy. But life doesn't stop. After the Old Kingdom stumbles, the country enters a strange in-between era historians politely call the First Intermediate Period. You, however, would probably just call it messy. Egypt fractures into two main rival kingdoms, with Thebes in the south and Heracleopolis in the north, glaring at each other across the desert, like siblings, fighting over who gets the bigger slice of cake. Spoiler: the fighting lasts for over a century. You wander into Thebes, and suddenly everything feels different. This southern city, which once lurked in the background, now takes center stage. Temples rise not in monumental perfection like at Giza, but with a scrappy determination, as if saying, "We're the future, trust us." The Theban rulers paint themselves as true heirs of the gods, even though their royal palaces look more like upgraded farmsteads. Still, they have charisma and ambition, which sometimes counts more than polished limestone blocks. Meanwhile, in Heracleopolis, the rulers act like nothing's changed. They keep the old titles, parade in the old style, and cling to old kingdom traditions, like someone wearing 1990s fashion in 2025. You almost admire their persistence, but you also know trends move on, and Egypt isn't buying what they're selling. The Thebans eventually start stealing the spotlight, thanks to military grit and a more flexible outlook. Quirky tidbit: in this era of political fragmentation, literature flourishes. Yes, in the middle of chaos, Egyptians start writing some of their best reflective works. One famous piece, The Dialogue of a Man with His Ba, basically reads like an ancient therapy session. A man talks to his soul about whether life is worth living. Imagine ancient Egyptians lying awake, worrying about existence the same way you do at 2 a.m. Some things never change. Still, life in the provinces isn't all doom-scrolling. Without a strong central government, local governors and townsfolk experiment with their own styles. Coffins become walking billboards of belief, stuffed with texts about the afterlife. Regional art grows bold and colorful, less stiff than before. You see a painted coffin lid with eyes staring back at you, carved so the deceased can see the living world even when buried. Spooky? Absolutely. But comforting, too, if you're afraid of being forgotten. Thebes starts flexing harder. They develop a fierce devotion to Ammonius, a local god who begins as a minor figure, but slowly grows into a national superstar. Priests chant his praises in small sanctuaries, not knowing he'll one day rival Ra himself as the king of gods. You notice how faith evolves here. People crave protection in unstable times, so gods who promise strength and rebirth rise to the top. Of course, war isn't far behind. Armies clash along the Nile, though armies may be too grand a word. Think more like local militias with spears, axes, and a lot of yelling. You trail behind one skirmish, sand kicking up as villagers turn soldiers, try to prove loyalty to their lords. No epic bronze chariots yet, no dramatic duels, just survival battles where victory often means who gets to keep their granary intact. Historians still argue whether the Thebans beat the Heracleopolitans with sheer military might or simply by outlasting them in endurance. Either way, Thebes eventually rises triumphant, unifying Egypt once again. The Middle Kingdom is born, not with the glitz of pyramid builders, but with a kind of resilient humility. After all, if you've lived through famine, war, and failed pharaohs, you learn to value stability above flashy monuments. As you float down the Nile toward a reunited Egypt, the land feels calmer, though scars remain. Farmers still whisper about bad harvests, but there's optimism in the air. It's like waking up after a long fever. Weak, shaky, but relieved to still be alive. Egypt's story is about to shift into one of its most balanced and creative eras. But right now, you just let the river rock you gently, carrying you from chaos toward renewal. The Nile glitters again, and with it, Egypt breathes easier. After the dust and quarrels of the first intermediate period, you glide into the Middle Kingdom, a time that feels less like a flashy fireworks show and more like a slow exhale. Egypt is back together, stitched under the rule of the Theban kings, particularly Mentuhotep II, who manages to end the feuds and finally unite the land. You picture him standing tall, not with pyramid-scale arrogance, but with the quiet relief of someone saying, "Okay, let's not do that chaos again." The capital shifts to Ichtoi, near modern-day Fayum, conveniently central and easier to control both north and south. You drift into its bustling streets, craftsmen hammering copper tools, merchants hawking linen, scribes scribbling endless records. The vibe is practical, organized, steady. Egyptians at this point seem more interested in let's keep things functional than in outdoing their ancestors' pyramids. A pyramid is still nice, sure, but maybe smaller, more modest, like when you realize your first car doesn't need to be a Ferrari. Mainstream historical fact: the Middle Kingdom sees huge investment in irrigation projects. Canals cut into the landscape, guiding Nile water into fields with precision. Farmers rejoice at better harvests, and granaries fill again. You wander past one of these canals, the water trickling like liquid gold, a symbol of order restored. Quirky tidbit: Egyptians during the Middle Kingdom had a fascination with stories, actual entertainment stories, not just religious hymns. You catch someone reciting the tale of Sinew, about an official who flees Egypt, lives abroad, and then returns in old age. The drama could be a Netflix miniseries, full of exile, longing, and redemption. It shows Egyptians weren't just managing fields, they were also dreaming, imagining, and empathizing with characters on paper. But even in stability, cracks lurk. Egypt's rulers still build pyramids, though not nearly as durable as the Old Kingdom ones. You walk into a Middle Kingdom pyramid, and honestly, it feels like a cheap knockoff. The limestone casing is gone, mud brick peeks through, and it's crumbling after just a few centuries. You imagine the pharaoh saying, "Don't worry, my pyramid will last forever," and future archaeologists just laughing. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs also expand Egypt's reach. Armies march south into Nubia, building forts along the Nile to control trade routes and resources like gold and exotic animals. You step inside one of these forts, its walls thick, its view commanding. Soldiers joke while sharpening weapons, but the tension is clear. Egypt wants wealth, and Nubia isn't handing it over willingly. Historians still argue whether this was more about military dominance or simple economic greed. But either way, Egypt digs in deep. Religion continues to shift. Osiris, god of the dead, grows even more popular. He becomes the great equalizer. Everyone, not just kings, can hope for rebirth in the afterlife. You hear villagers singing his praises at small shrines, their faith tangible. It's less about worshiping distant gods and more about building personal connections. The pharaoh may still be divine, but ordinary Egyptians are now claiming their own slice of eternity. The Middle Kingdom also has a flair for bureaucracy. Scribes multiply like cats in an alley. Papyrus scrolls pile high with records, harvest tallies, tax lists, letters between officials. You sit beside one weary scribe, his reed brush scratching as he mutters, "If one more governor asks for 3 extra baskets of barley." It's oddly comforting to realize office complaints haven't changed much in 4,000 years. And yet, even in this era of organization, Egyptians can't resist dreaming big. Temples expand, statues multiply, art softens in tone. Sculptures of pharaohs show more human features, less godlike perfection, more weary rulers carrying the weight of responsibility. You study one such statue, the eyes heavy, the face lined, and you think, yep, that guy has seen some things. The Middle Kingdom doesn't scream for attention the way the Old Kingdom's pyramids do. Instead, it hums with resilience and creativity. But all steady rhythms eventually skip a beat. Foreign traders creep in, new threats emerge, and Egypt's confidence will soon face another storm. For now, though, you float on the Nile, lulled by the gentle sense that Egypt, for the moment, has found its balance. The Nile whispers as you drift into Egypt's next storm. The Middle Kingdom hums along for centuries, but stability is like a clay jar. It looks solid until a few cracks let water seep out. Egypt is strong, yes, but it's also surrounded by ambitious neighbors. To the east, across the Sinai, a new group of people is watching and waiting, the Hyksos. Their name sounds mysterious, but in Egyptian it roughly means rulers of foreign lands. You're about to see why they'll be more than a footnote. At first, the Hyksos slip in quietly, like guests overstaying their welcome. Traders bring their goods, horses, chariots, new kinds of bronze weapons. Egyptians, curious but cautious, adopt some of these ideas. You watch as local soldiers try out a chariot for the first time, wobbling like someone learning to ride a bike. But novelty has a price. Slowly, more Hyksos settle in the delta, blending into Egyptian towns. Before long, they're not just visiting, they're running the place. Mainstream fact: around 1650 BCE, the Hyksos established their own dynasty in northern Egypt, ruling from a city called Avaris. Imagine it, Egypt, the land of divine pharaohs, suddenly bowing to foreign kings. That's a bruise to the national ego, if there ever was one. Quirky tidbit: the Hyksos love introducing new tech. They bring the composite bow, deadlier and more flexible than Egypt's old wooden bows. They also popularized the horse-drawn chariot, what will eventually become the Ferrari of ancient battlefields. You chuckle as Egyptian nobles, once content with donkeys, now demand sleek imported horses to show off. Fashion has always been about status. But Egyptians don't just roll over. In the south, native rulers still hold Thebes. They grit their teeth, pay tribute, and quietly build their strength. You picture one Theban prince seething as he hands over sacks of grain to Hyksos tax collectors, thinking, one day, this ends. Historians still argue whether the Hyksos takeover was a violent invasion or more of a slow infiltration that Egyptians eventually rebelled against. Either way, resentment simmers like a pot left too long on the fire. Life under the Hyksos isn't all misery, though. Egypt absorbs new ideas, improved metalworking, better fortifications, and exotic goods flowing in from the Levant. You stroll through a delta market and see Asiatic traders haggling over spices, timber, and even musical instruments. For ordinary Egyptians, the foreign kings might not feel like the end of the world. After all, bread still bakes, beer still foams, and the Nile still floods. Still, pride is a powerful motivator. In Thebes, scribes begin writing propaganda painting the Hyksos as barbarians who don't honor Egyptian gods. One tale even claims the Hyksos king complained about hippopotamuses in Thebes making too much noise, and that became a casus belli. You grin, imagining wars starting over noisy river hippos. Quirky, yes, but also telling. Egyptians needed a narrative to justify kicking out the foreigners. Tensions rise. The Theban princes launch raids, small at first, then larger. You crouch beside a campfire as warriors whisper about reclaiming Egypt, sharpening bronze swords under starlight. The Hyksos, confident in their northern strongholds, underestimate this simmering resistance. You can almost feel the pendulum swinging back toward Egyptian control. As the fighting heats up, southern rulers like Seqenenre Tao and Kamos become folk heroes. Seqenenre, in particular, leaves a haunting story. His mummy shows gruesome head wounds, likely from battle against the Hyksos. Standing over his resting place, you shiver. He literally gave his life for the cause of unification. His sacrifice sparks fury, and his successors carry the torch. Finally, a Theban king named Ahmose rallies Egypt. He pushes north with determination, adopting Hyksos chariots and weapons to fight fire with fire. You watch chariots thunder across the delta plains, dust clouds rising, warriors shouting. Egypt, once humiliated, now fights with borrowed tools and sheer determination. The Hyksos, caught off guard, crumble. Avaris falls, and with it, foreign rule. Egypt breathes again, angry, scarred, but triumphant. The lesson lingers. Outsiders can be useful, but they can also take over if you're not careful. As you watch the Theban banners rise over the delta, you sense the dawn of something fierce. Egypt isn't just restored. It's about to become more powerful, more ambitious, and far less naive. The expulsion of the Hyksos is the spark that ignites the new kingdom, Egypt's most famous and dazzling age. For now, though, you sit on the banks of the Nile, the night air heavy with smoke and victory songs, knowing you've just witnessed Egypt learn to fight like never before. The Nile ripples beneath your boat, but this time, the river feels charged. Egypt is no longer just recovering. It's rising like a warrior, shaking off the dust of defeat. The Hyksos are gone, and with their expulsion comes a new attitude. Egypt isn't going to sit quietly behind its desert borders anymore. Oh no, it's going to stride out, armored and ambitious, into the wider world. Welcome to the new kingdom, the age of empire, gold, temples, and some of the most famous pharaohs you'll ever meet. At the start, Ahmose I, the same king who kicked the Hyksos out, takes a long look around and says, Never again. He fortifies the delta, reorganizes the military, and ensures Egypt has chariots and bronze weapons on standby. You walk past ranks of soldiers training in orderly lines, the clatter of bronze, swords ringing in your ears. This isn't the old militia-style defense. This is a professional army, sleek, sharp, and ready to roll. Mainstream historical fact: Egypt pushes its borders further than ever. Campaigns march deep into Nubia to secure gold mines and north into Canaan to control trade routes. The Nile becomes a highway for soldiers and loot alike. You can practically hear the clinking of treasure-filled chests being hauled onto boats, ivory, incense, exotic animals, and more. Egypt isn't just surviving now, it's thriving on conquest. Quirky tidbit: Egyptians during this time loved to list spoils of war in almost comical detail. One inscription bragged about taking 784 hands of enemies, as if the battlefield doubled as a bizarre math competition. Another lists captured goats, geese, and jars of honey right next to enemy prisoners. You shake your head. Imagine fighting a war and then bragging equally about poultry. Religion adapts, too. Ammonius, once a small Theban god, rockets to the top as the patron of empire. The pharaohs rebrand him as Ammonius Ra, merging him with the sun god, and suddenly he's the cosmic heavyweight. Temples to Ammonius rise everywhere, the most spectacular at Karnak, where columns soar like stone forests. You stroll through the temple courtyard, feeling dwarfed and oddly hushed, as if the stones themselves demand reverence. Priests gain enormous power here, sometimes even rivaling pharaohs in influence. Historians still argue whether this growing priestly class was Egypt's strength or its Achilles' heel. Art and architecture follow the empire's swagger. Colossal statues of kings loom over temple gates, their stern gazes daring anyone to challenge Egypt. You pause before one, its stone lips curled in a faint smirk. It's propaganda in rock. Bow down, I'm eternal. And honestly, it works. Even thousands of years later, you feel yourself involuntarily impressed. But empire isn't all glory. Marching far afield drains resources, and rebellious provinces in Canaan flare up like stubborn campfires. You witness messengers racing back to Thebes, scrolls tucked under arms, breathless with news of yet another skirmish in the north. Egypt must juggle victories with the constant headache of holding on to them. Expansion is intoxicating, but exhausting. The cultural life back home, however, glitters. You wander into a festival in Thebes. Musicians strum harps, dancers twirl, beer flows freely. Priests parade golden statues of Ammonius down the streets, crowds cheering. For the average Egyptian, empire translates into festivals, food, and maybe a shiny trinket brought home by a relative in the army. Life feels rich, celebratory, and buzzing with confidence. One unusual feature of the new kingdom: the Valley of the Kings. Instead of building giant pyramids that scream, "Rob me, please," pharaohs now carve secret tombs into desert cliffs. You creep into one, torchlight flickering over walls painted with stars, gods, and winding journeys into the afterlife. The corridors twist like mazes, designed to hide royal burials from tomb robbers. Spoiler, it doesn't always work, but the attempt is clever. You can almost hear a pharaoh muttering, "Good luck finding this one." As Egypt struts into the new kingdom, you sense the energy shift. It's no longer just a land of pyramids and farming villages. It's a full-fledged empire, shoulders squared, ready to play on the world stage. Chariots roll, temples rise, priests chant, and the Nile carries riches down its length like liquid gold. Still, you know Egypt's story well enough by now. Every rise comes with a future fall. But for now, the empire sparkles in the desert sun, and you let yourself bask in its glow, drifting between colossal statues and shimmering waters, lulled by the hum of a civilization at its dazzling peak. The desert air feels warmer, heavier, as you step deeper into the new kingdom's golden age. The chariots roll, the temples gleam, but the real stories are about the people, especially the rulers whose names echo down history like thunder. This is Egypt's celebrity era, the time of Hatshepsut, Thutmose, and the warrior kings who turned the Nile into the spine of an empire. Let's start with Hatshepsut, because honestly, she steals the show. Picture this. A woman stepping up to rule as pharaoh in a world where that was practically unheard of. She doesn't just sit quietly on the throne either. She goes full pharaoh mode, wearing the royal beard, commissioning statues, and carving her name into temples. You wander through her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, its terraces rising against the cliffs like a giant staircase to heaven. Reliefs on the walls show her divine birth and a daring trade expedition to the mysterious land of Punt. Traders bring back incense trees, exotic animals, and treasures so strange Egyptians don't even have proper words for them. Historians still argue whether Punt was in modern-day Eritrea, Somalia, or Yemen, but wherever it was, it sure impressed the home crowd. Quirky tidbit: on those temple walls, Hatshepsut has herself depicted sometimes as a man, complete with the false beard. It wasn't confusion, it was political theater. Egyptians expected a pharaoh to look a certain way, so she played the role while quietly reshaping expectations. It's the ultimate ancient power move. If a system won't bend for you, you bend the image of yourself to fit the system. Then comes Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. Except, unlike Napoleon, he actually managed to expand and keep most of what he conquered. Under his rule, Egyptian armies march into Syria, Palestine, and Nubia, collecting tribute and planting Egypt's flag across the region. You ride along in one of his chariots, the horses snorting, the wheels rattling. Dust kicks up as Egyptian troops charge into battle with terrifying precision. Lists of conquered towns fill temple walls like grocery receipts gone wild. Egypt isn't just defending itself anymore. It's dictating the rules of the ancient Near East. Mainstream fact: at the Battle of Megiddo, Thutmose III executes one of history's earliest recorded military campaigns, complete with strategic planning that still impresses generals today. He marches through a narrow mountain pass others consider too risky, catches the enemy by surprise, and wins decisively. You picture the enemy coalition scattering, their banners trampled under Egyptian hooves. Back at home, all this conquest means gold, goods, and exotic animals flow into Thebes. You stroll through the royal zoo, where baboons screech, giraffes strut, and Nubian cattle munch lazily. The empire has turned Egypt into a cultural melting pot, with luxury items spilling into elite households. Imagine sipping beer from a Syrian-style goblet while petting a lapdog imported from Crete. Egypt at this point is basically flexing on everyone. Religion soars with the empire. Ammonius Ra at Karnak becomes the undisputed superstar of the gods. Each pharaoh adds new halls, statues, and obelisks to the temple complex, turning it into a city of stone dedicated to divine power. You walk among the colossal columns, the carvings so deep you can still feel them under your fingertips. But you also notice something. Priests of Ammonius are getting richer and more powerful, owning land, controlling wealth, and sometimes whispering against the pharaoh. Historians still argue whether this priestly power grab was the seed of future instability. Everywhere you look, confidence radiates. Sculptures of kings are larger than life, chests out, jaws clenched, eyes staring into eternity. Yet even here, the cracks show in small ways. Tomb robbing becomes rampant, so rampant that entire villages of workers, like Deir el-Medina, are dedicated to designing elaborate hidden tombs in the Valley of the Kings. You squeeze into one of these secret passageways, torchlight flickering over vivid scenes of gods, demons, and boats sailing through the night sky. Egyptians are doubling down on afterlife prep, because in this glittering age, no one wants to be left without their golden ticket to eternity. You step back outside into the blazing sun, temples rising like mountains of stone behind you. The empire hums with confidence, wealth, and military strength. But you also sense the weight of ambition pressing on Egypt's shoulders. Expansion is addictive and exhausting. For now, though, you bask in the glow of a civilization at its proudest, striding across the ancient world like it owns the place. The air shimmers with heat as you wander deeper into the new kingdom, but the mood feels unsettled. The monuments are still massive, the empire is still wealthy, but a particular pharaoh is about to flip the script entirely. His name is Amenhotep IV, but you'll know him better as Akhenaten, the king who basically said, "Forget your thousands of gods. I've got a new one." Spoiler, This doesn't go smoothly. At first, Amenhotep IV plays the standard game: temples, ceremonies, processions. But then he announces that the sun disk, Aten, isn't just another god, it's the god. Forget Ammonius, forget Ra, forget Osiris. The Aten alone deserves devotion. You blink. In a land where religion is woven into every sip of beer and every brushstroke on a tomb wall, this is like someone uninstalling all your apps and insisting you only need one. He even renames himself Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, and builds a brand new capital, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna. You step into this city, and it feels unlike traditional Egypt. Temples are wide open, no dark corridors, because sunlight itself is the sacred presence. The art changes too. Pharaohs and queens are shown with elongated faces, full bellies, and intimate family scenes. You see Akhenaten lounging under the Aten's rays with his wife Nefertiti and their daughters, looking almost casual, like an ancient family Christmas card. Historians still argue whether this artistic style was religious symbolism, a medical condition, or just Akhenaten's personal aesthetic. Quirky tidbit: Akhenaten's radical art even shows him kissing his children in public, something no stiff-lipped pharaoh ever dared. It's oddly wholesome, until you realize the rest of Egypt is basically freaking out. Priests of Ammonius, once the most powerful in the land, suddenly find their temples abandoned, their offerings stopped. Imagine running the most profitable business in town, and overnight your franchise gets shut down. Akhenaten pours resources into his new capital, but the empire beyond its borders begins wobbling. Letters discovered in the Amarna archives reveal desperate pleas from vassal states. "Help us, we're under attack." Akhenaten. He doesn't respond much. He's too busy composing hymns to the Aten, basking in sunlit courtyards. Egypt, once the lion of the Near East, suddenly looks like it's napping. And then there's Nefertiti. She's not just a queen in the background. She's carved into reliefs alongside Akhenaten, nearly his equal in size and presence. Some scholars even suggest she briefly ruled after his death, maybe even as the mysterious pharaoh Nefertiti. Historians still argue if she was a co-ruler, a solo ruler, or simply the most powerful first lady Egypt ever had. Whatever the truth, her limestone bust, now in Berlin, is one of the most recognizable faces in the world. But Akhenaten's dream doesn't last. After his death, Egypt snaps back to its old ways faster than you'd switch back to Wi-Fi after trying dial-up. Temples of Aten crumble, statues of Akhenaten are smashed, and his name is scrubbed from king lists as if he were an embarrassing typo. The priests of Ammonius reclaim their power with a vengeance, dusting off their temples and saying, "Right now, where were we?" Into this mess steps a boy king, Tutankhaten. Under pressure from advisors and priests, he changes his name to Tutankhamen. Yes, that Tutankhamen, and restores the old gods. He dies young, probably around 18, but his fame skyrockets millennia later when his nearly intact tomb is discovered in 1922. You squeeze into that tomb, imagining Howard Carter holding a candle as the sealed chamber flickers to life. Gold gleams from every corner, chariots, thrones, jewelry, and that iconic mask staring with serene eternity. Tut wasn't a powerful king in life, but in death, he became the superstar of ancient Egypt. Standing in the Valley of the Kings, you let the wind whistle through the cliffs. Akhenaten's sunlit revolution has burned out. Tutankhamen has restored the old order, and Egypt has survived another round of upheaval. But beneath the surface, you feel the tension. Priests wield immense power. Pharaohs wobble between godhood and politics, and the empire is still fragile. The stage is set for triumphs and disasters yet to come. The torches flicker as you step deeper into the Valley of the Kings, and the air feels heavy, almost theatrical. Egypt has just endured the strange sunlight obsession of Akhenaten and the fragile reign of Tutankhamen. Now the new kingdom needs a stabilizer, a pharaoh who can restore order, puff up Egypt's pride, and rebuild its image. Enter Horemheb, a general who seizes the throne after Tut's death. You can almost hear the collective sigh of the old priesthood. Finally, someone sensible. Horemheb wipes away the Amarna experiment like it was a bad chalk doodle. Temples to Ammonius roar back into life. Traditional ceremonies return, and Akhenaten's name gets scrubbed harder than your embarrassing tweets from 2010. He rules long enough to re-cement Egypt's power, though he dies without an heir. So he appoints his vizier, Paramesu, who takes the throne as Ramesses I, kicking off one of the most famous dynasties in Egyptian history, the 19th. You walk with Ramesses I's son, Seti I, into massive construction projects. His temple at Abydos stretches before you, walls covered in lists of kings past. It's like Egypt's official Hall of Fame, though, curiously, names like Akhenaten and Tutankhamun are missing. Ancient cancel culture in action. Seti pushes military campaigns north, clashing with the Hittites, a rising power in Anatolia. Egypt, once untouchable, now faces serious competition. And then comes Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great, who basically puts extra into pharaoh life. He rules for 66 years, outliving many of his children, and covering Egypt with so many statues of himself that you wonder if he secretly invented selfies. The temples at Abu Simbel are jaw-dropping, colossal seated statues gazing out over the Nile. You feel dwarfed, a tiny in the shadow of this king who wants the world to remember him forever. Mainstream fact: Ramesses II fought the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, one of the earliest battles in history, with detailed accounts from both sides. Each version, of course, claims victory. Egyptian inscriptions brag about Ramesses heroically driving back the enemy alone, while Hittite records paint a very different picture. Historians still argue whether Kadesh was a draw, a loss, or a cleverly spun PR campaign. Either way, the aftermath is groundbreaking. The first known peace treaty in history, carved in both Egyptian and Akkadian. It's basically the world's first, let's agree to stop fighting and grab lunch moment. Now here's the quirky bit. Ramesses II had so many children, over 100 by some counts, that he had entire tombs built just to house them. You imagine the awkward family dinners. Pass the bread, son number 58. In fact, his long reign was such a constant that when he finally died at about 90, Egyptians supposedly whispered, the sun itself must have died. But despite Ramesses's grandeur, cracks form beneath the gold. Successors struggle with invasions, famines, and corruption. The temples of Karnak and Luxor remain glorious, but maintaining them drains resources. Priests of Ammonius, flush with land and offerings, rival pharaohs in wealth. The royal line weakens, and by the 20th dynasty, Egypt is wobbling again. The reign of Ramesses III looks promising at first. He beats back invasions from the so-called Sea Peoples, mysterious groups who sweep across the Mediterranean like a storm. You picture the Egyptian fleet clashing with them, arrows flying, boats capsizing on the Nile Delta. Mainstream fact: reliefs at Medinet Habu vividly show the battle, with Egyptian ships hooking enemy vessels like fish. Egypt survives, but just barely. Grain shortages and labor strikes follow, including the world's first recorded workers' strike at Deir el-Medina, where artisans down tools and demand their rations. Quirky, but relatable. And here comes the shadow over it all, the assassination conspiracy against Ramesses III. Papyrus records reveal a harem plot, concubines and officials scheming to put another son on the throne. Historians still argue about how successful it was. CT scans of his mummy show a deep cut across his throat, suggesting he didn't make it out alive. Ancient palace intrigue, as deadly as any modern soap opera. By the end of the New Kingdom, the pharaohs are fading into mediocrity. Tombs are robbed, officials grow corrupt, and the great empire begins to shrink inward. You step away from the grand colossi of Ramesses and into crumbling temples, dust blowing through halls once crowded with priests and offerings. The golden age is dimming, and the Nile itself seems to sigh. The stone corridors grow cooler as you step into the aftermath of the New Kingdom. The golden glow of Ramesses II has faded, and Egypt now feels like an aging superstar, still wearing glitter jackets, but forgetting the lyrics. The priests of Ammonius dominate at Thebes, the pharaohs shrink in stature, and ordinary Egyptians face shortages, tomb robberies, and a creeping sense that their world is no longer invincible. You drift through the 21st dynasty, often called the start of the Third Intermediate Period. It's like Egypt entered its awkward Middle Age phase. Pharaohs still wear the crowns, but their grip on power is shaky. Priests in Thebes effectively rule Upper Egypt, while the kings of Tanis control the north. Imagine two CEOs claiming the same company, one handling HR and the other IT, but both insisting they're in charge. Historians still argue whether this division was peaceful cooperation or constant tension bubbling under the surface. The quirky part? Pharaohs of Tanis often recycled burial goods from older kings. Mummies of past rulers, including Ramesses II, were hidden away in secret caches, like the famous Deir el-Bahari find, where priests stashed dozens of royal bodies to protect them from tomb robbers. You imagine the quiet midnight procession of priests hauling coffins across the desert, whispering prayers while trying not to trip in the sand. It's strangely touching. Egypt's great kings reduced to cargo carried under the stars. As dynasties shuffle like cards, foreign influence seeps in. Libyan chieftains settle in Egypt, eventually becoming rulers themselves. They adopt Egyptian titles and rituals, but you can almost feel the cultural blend, new accents in the palace, fresh military tactics, and family trees that twist into knots. One famous pharaoh, Shoshenq, sometimes linked to the biblical Shishak, even campaigns into Canaan. His triumphs are carved at Karnak, but the grandeur feels thinner, like a movie sequel that doesn't quite live up to the original. Mainstream fact: Egypt's military might wanes in this era, replaced by diplomacy and local alliances. Neighboring powers rise. Assyria flexes its muscles, Phoenician cities flourish, and tiny Israelite kingdoms scribble down stories that still echo today. Egypt, once the center of everything, now plays second fiddle. Meanwhile, art and religion keep ticking, though with a nostalgic air. Temples are smaller, less polished, yet still attempt to echo the glory of Karnak. Ordinary Egyptians keep praying to their household gods, still stuffing amulets into their clothing, still muttering spells against snakes and nightmares. The continuity is comforting. You can lose empires, but you don't stop wanting a good night's sleep. And then, as if Egypt wasn't juggling enough, the Nubians sweep in from the south. The Kushite kings of Napata see the chaos and think, we could totally fix this. They march north, conquering Egypt, and establish the 25th dynasty. Suddenly, you're standing in Thebes watching Nubian pharaohs in leopard skin cloaks performing rituals at Ammonius' temple. Their statues have distinctive features, their inscriptions proudly blending Nubian and Egyptian traditions. Egypt's culture doesn't collapse, it expands. But you can feel the irony. The conquerors from Kush respect Egyptian religion so much that they actually try harder to restore old rituals than Egyptians themselves. Quirky tidbit: one Kushite king, Taharka, shows up in the Bible, battling Assyrian armies. His reign marks a rare moment where Egypt once again feels like a heavyweight, building temples, defending borders, and earning mentions in foreign records. Still, the Assyrians are relentless, storming Egypt's cities, plundering Memphis, and eventually forcing the Nubians to retreat south. Egypt is left exhausted, like a boxer staggering after too many rounds. By the 26th dynasty, local rulers in the Delta reassert control, particularly at Sais. This Sate Renaissance feels like Egypt's last big comeback tour. Kings like Santic I hire Greek mercenaries, reopen trade routes, and commission art in the old styles. You walk past statues that look straight out of the Old Kingdom, nostalgia carved in stone. Historians still argue if this was a true revival or just cosplay for pharaohs who knew the empire's best days were gone. Through it all, ordinary life continues. Farmers still flood their fields with the Nile. Scribes still practice hieroglyphs. Children still play with clay hippos. But the grandeur of Egypt is now a patchwork of memories, foreign dynasties, and fragile revivals. The land of pyramids has entered its twilight, though the Nile still flows, indifferent to who sits on the throne. The sun sinks lower as you follow Egypt into the arms of Rome. Cleopatra's fall has left the Nile Valley not with independence, but as the personal property of the Roman emperor. That's right, Egypt isn't just another province, it's the emperor's private estate. Senators are forbidden from even setting foot here without permission. Rome knows how crucial this land is. Its grain ships feed the empire, and control of Egypt means control of Roman stomachs. You stroll along Alexandria's harbor in the 1st century CE, and it's bustling. Greek merchants argue with Egyptian boatmen. Roman officials strut in togas. Jewish scholars debate in synagogues. Alexandria is cosmopolitan, chaotic, and deeply influential. It hosts the Great Library and its companion, the Serapeum, temples to Serapis, theaters, gymnasiums, and markets where silks from India and spices from Arabia mingle with papyrus and grain. You can almost taste the mix of cultures in the air. Mainstream fact: the Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, towers nearly 100 meters over the coast. Its beacon of fire and polished bronze mirrors guides ships safely into the harbor. For centuries, it's the tallest man-made structure on Earth after the pyramids. Standing beneath it, you feel like you're in the shadow of something both futuristic and eternal. But Egypt's role in Rome is both vital and humiliating. Roman governors, called prefects, rule with efficiency but little love for Egyptian traditions. Temples do get funding, but mostly as a way to keep the locals quiet. Quirky detail: Roman emperors actually adopt pharaonic titles, getting themselves depicted in hieroglyphs as if they were old-school kings. You can find reliefs of Augustus, Hadrian, even Tiberius offering to the gods in full pharaoh regalia. It's cosplay politics at its finest. Still, cracks show. Taxes are crushing, and peasant revolts flare along the Nile. Alexandria itself witnesses violent riots between Greeks, Jews, and Egyptians, often so fierce that Roman legions have to intervene. The Nile floods still dictate prosperity, but mismanagement makes bad years worse. Historians still argue whether Roman rule improved stability or accelerated decline. It probably depends on whether you were a grain merchant in Alexandria or a farmer sweating in the Fayum. As centuries roll on, Christianity rises. By the 2nd and 3rd century CE, Egyptian cities become hotbeds of Christian thought. Alexandria produces figures like Origen and Athanasius, theologians whose debates ripple across the empire. The desert itself fills with monks, men and women retreating into caves, founding monasteries, and inventing new forms of spiritual discipline. You trudge through sand to hear their silence, broken only by prayers carried on the wind. Meanwhile, the old gods fade. Temples close, hieroglyphs stop being taught, and the language of the pharaohs slowly dies. By the 4th century CE, under Emperor Theodosius, pagan worship is banned outright. The last hieroglyphic inscription ever written, at Philae in 394 CE, marks the quiet extinction of a tradition stretching back 3,000 years. You feel the weight of that moment, a pen scratching out words that no one will understand again until the 19th century. Quirky tidbit: even as hieroglyphs die, Egypt continues to invent. Coptic script, a fusion of Greek letters and Demotic Egyptian, becomes the vehicle of Christian texts. So while the sacred carvings vanish, everyday Egyptians still keep their language alive in a new alphabet. By the time Rome splits into East and West, Egypt falls under the eastern half, the Byzantine Empire. Grain still flows out, monasteries still multiply, and Alexandria still shines as a center of learning, though often overshadowed by Constantinople. But whispers of new armies stir from Arabia, carrying not Greek or Latin, but Arabic and the words of Islam. The story of pharaohs and hieroglyphs has ended, but Egypt's place as a crossroads endures. You close your eyes by the fading light of the lighthouse, its stones already beginning to crumble under earthquakes, and sense that the next chapter of Egypt will be written in a new script, under new rulers, yet always with the Nile flowing calmly at its heart. The sky feels heavier as you step into Egypt's late period, that stretch where the land of pyramids is both stubbornly proud and painfully fragile. You're in the 26th dynasty now, at Sais, where pharaohs try to polish Egypt's tarnished crown. Kings like Psamtik I and Necho II invite Greek mercenaries, hire foreign traders, and even let Greek settlers build a colony at Naucratis in the Delta. You hear Greek voices mingling with Egyptian in the markets, the smell of olive oil mixing with beer, and it feels like Egypt is trying to reinvent itself by remixing with outsiders. Mainstream fact: Necho II launches ambitious projects, including a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea. He even experiments with naval expeditions, supposedly sending Phoenician sailors around Africa, centuries before Europeans tried it. Imagine being one of those sailors, hugging the unknown coastline, probably muttering, Hope this isn't flat after all. But Egypt's renaissance comes with shadows. The empire no longer controls the Near East. Babylonians rise, Persians loom, and Egypt is basically that grandparent who insists they can still drive, but quietly hands over the keys. Pharaoh Apries suffers military disasters, while Psamtik III tries to resist foreign powers, but crumbles when the Persians sweep in. The Persian conquest under Cambyses II in 525 BCE is brutal. You feel the shift as Egypt becomes just another province in the vast Achaemenid Empire. Cambyses reportedly mocks Egyptian religion, even stabbing the sacred Apis bull. Historians still argue whether this was genuine sacrilege or just Persian propaganda, later exaggerated by Greek writers. Either way, Egyptians resent foreign rule, though Persians also keep the bureaucracy humming and temples funded. It's complicated, like being conquered by a bossy landlord who still pays for the plumbing. Quirky tidbit: some Persian satraps adopt Egyptian titles, blending styles. Imagine an official writing decrees in hieroglyphs while sipping Persian wine and wearing a beard braided differently than locals expect. Cross-cultural chic, 5th century BCE edition. Still, Egyptians don't give up. Revolts simmer, some successful, some crushed. Kings like Amartius briefly restore independence, only for Persians to return with armies. The Nile keeps flowing, but sovereignty feels like a candle constantly snuffed out and relit. And then you hear new footsteps echoing on the horizon. The Greeks. Alexander the Great storms into Egypt in 332 BCE, greeted as a liberator. Tired of Persians, Egyptians welcome him with open arms. You follow Alexander to Memphis, where he offers sacrifices to Apis, then down to the coast, where he founds a brand new city, Alexandria. Its grid-like streets, Greek theaters, and bustling harbor feel different from any Egyptian city before. Marble columns sprout where mud brick houses once stood, and the world shifts on its axis. Mainstream fact: under Alexander and his successors, the Ptolemies, Egypt becomes the intellectual hub of the Mediterranean. The Library of Alexandria rises, filled with scrolls from every corner of the known world. You can almost smell the papyrus, ink, and dust of lost knowledge. Astronomy, medicine, literature, all now vanished in tragic fires and neglect. Historians still argue whether it was Caesar, later Christians, or centuries of mishaps that destroyed it. But the truth remains a haunting mystery. The quirky twist: Cleopatra VII, last of the Ptolemies, becomes Egypt's most famous queen, not because of pyramids or temples, but because of her dramatic entanglements with Rome. You imagine her reclining on a golden couch, casually chatting with Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony, weaving Egypt's survival into her love affairs. She's witty, multilingual, and fiercely political, yet Roman propaganda later paints her as a manipulative seductress. The double standard, alive and well 2 millennia ago. But the story turns tragic. After Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian, soon Augustus, absorbs Egypt into the Roman Empire. Cleopatra and Antony fall, quite literally, and the independence of Egypt vanishes for good. The Nile becomes Rome's breadbasket, its grain feeding hungry mouths from Spain to Syria. Pharaohs are no more, now. Emperors in distant Rome hold the titles. You stand on the banks of the Nile, watching Roman ships loaded with wheat glide downstream. Temples still rise in places like Philae, but hieroglyphs slowly fade, replaced by Greek and Latin scripts. Egypt, once the world's proudest empire, is now a jewel in another crown. The ancient dream hasn't ended. It's just been folded into someone else's story. The air smells different now, spices, incense, and a hint of desert dust, as you cross from the age of Rome and Byzantium into something entirely new. It's the 7th century CE, and Arab armies surge out of the Arabian Peninsula, carrying both the sword and the Quran. In 641, Egypt falls swiftly to the forces of Amr ibn al-As. You stand at the gates of Babylon Fortress, near today's Cairo, as Byzantine resistance collapses and a new chapter begins. Mainstream fact: Amr establishes the first Islamic capital of Egypt at Fustat, just north of Memphis. Mud brick houses line its streets, and the mosque of Amr ibn al-As, still standing today in rebuilt form, becomes the very first mosque in Africa. The call to prayer echoes over the Nile, a sound that will never leave Egypt again. The transition isn't as abrupt as you might expect. Taxes remain, farmers still farm, scribes still scribble. But now, Arabic slowly replaces Greek and Coptic in administration. The quirky detail? For centuries, the poll tax on non-Muslims ensures that many Egyptians remain Christian, filling monasteries deep in the desert. Conversion is gradual, not overnight. You can picture families weighing their options over bread. Keep paying extra taxes, or join the growing Muslim community. The Nile, as always, dictates life. Good floods bring abundance. Poor floods bring famine. Governors appointed by distant caliphs try to balance the books, sometimes with heavy hands. Egyptians grumble, but the country remains too valuable for any ruler to neglect. Grain and wealth flow not to Rome anymore, but to Medina, then Damascus, then Baghdad. Egypt is once again the breadbasket of empires. Centuries roll by, and Egypt passes between dynasties like a prized jewel. Under the Umayyads, then Abbasids, the province remains rich, but distant rulers rarely visit. Local governors sometimes rebel, carving out mini-kingdoms. You stroll through Fustat and hear traders speaking Arabic, Greek, Coptic, even Syriac. Egypt is no longer isolated. It's plugged into a vast Islamic world stretching from Spain to Central Asia. Then comes the Fatimid Caliphate in the 10th century, and Egypt is thrust into the spotlight again. The Fatimids, a Shuraid dynasty from North Africa, conquer Egypt in 969 and found a brand new capital, Al-Qahira. The victorious, which you know as Cairo. Its streets buzz with markets, scholars, mosques, and palaces. Al-Azhar Mosque rises, destined to become the most famous university in the Islamic world. You wander its arcades, listening to debates on law, philosophy, astronomy, even medicine. It's like a medieval TED Talk festival, only with more turbans. Quirky tidbit: the Fatimids love parades. They stage elaborate public processions, where caliphs display jewel-encrusted weapons, exotic animals, and gold-embroidered banners. Crowds cheer, children chase musicians, and the whole city becomes a theater of power. But behind the glitter, famines and Nile failures sometimes bring misery. The contrast between pomp and hunger feels as sharp as the sun over the desert. Historians still argue whether Egypt thrived most under Fatimid tolerance. Christians and Jews often held high offices, or whether the heavy taxation and factionalism undermined stability. The truth, as always, seems messy. But the Fatimids leave their mark. Cairo is established as the beating heart of Egypt, a city that will outlast empires. By the 12th century, storms gather again. Crusaders from Europe clash with Islamic forces across the Levant, and Egypt becomes a prize worth fighting for. Saladin, the Kurdish general who topples the Fatimids in 1171, turns Egypt into the base of the Ayyubid dynasty. You watch him reorganize armies, build the massive citadel of Cairo, and prepare for battles with Richard the Lionheart. His reputation for chivalry echoes in both Arabic and Western chronicles, though the reality, like most wars, was far grittier. The Nile flows on, but Egypt is no longer the land of pharaohs or Rome's breadbasket. It's now a vital province in the Islamic world, its identity reshaped yet still familiar. Farmers still bend over fields, scribes still record harvests, children still splash in the river's edge. But when they look up, the skyline of Cairo now glitters with minarets, and the call to prayer floats gently over the rooftops, a new sound settling into the eternal rhythm of Egypt. The clamor of Cairo's streets hums in your ears as you move deeper into the medieval swirl of Egypt's story. Saladin has passed, leaving behind the Ayyubid dynasty, but another force is about to steal the stage, the Mamluks. These were slave soldiers, mostly Turks and Circassians, bought young, trained to fight, and technically property. And yet, in a plot twist worthy of a Netflix special, they end up ruling Egypt outright. Mainstream fact: in 1250, after the last Ayyubid sultan dies, the Mamluks seize power. Their reign will last for centuries, longer than many dynasties of pharaohs. You stroll through Cairo and see their fingerprints everywhere: towering mosques, madrasas, caravanserais, and aqueducts. The Mamluks don't just fight, they build, endowing the city with architecture that still dazzles. Their rule isn't just bricks and domes, though. These warriors face one of history's greatest threats, the Mongols. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Mamluks defeat Mongol forces, the first real check on the seemingly unstoppable horde. Imagine standing on that battlefield, dust clouds, clashing steel, and the shock of realizing the Mongols can bleed. Egypt becomes the defender of the Islamic world, and its prestige soars. Quirky tidbit: despite being technically slaves, Mamluks are among the wealthiest elites of their time. They own estates, collect taxes, and strut around Cairo in embroidered silks, while still technically barred from passing power to their sons. The trick? They just keep importing new Mamluks, training them, and repeating the cycle. It's like a political system that constantly refreshes its hard drive. Historians still argue whether this made Egypt unusually stable or dangerously unpredictable. The Mamluk era also cements Cairo as a crossroads of trade. Spices, silks, and precious stones flow from India and the east through the Red Sea, across the desert, and into the Mediterranean. You wander the Khan el-Khalili Bazaar, inhaling cardamom, hearing merchants haggle in Arabic, Greek, and Persian. Cairo feels like the center of the world, until Europeans start sneaking around Africa by sea, cutting Egypt out of the loop. Then comes the 14th century, and with it, disaster, the Black Death. Plague tears through Egypt, killing maybe a third of the population. You can almost hear the eerie silence of abandoned fields, the grief in villages where too few remain to bury the dead. The Nile still flows, indifferent, but society buckles. Even Cairo, so vibrant, feels haunted. Still, the Mamluks recover enough to keep their hold on power. They build the Sultan Hassan Mosque, whose towering minarets you crane your neck to see. They commission madrasas, where scholars debate astronomy and law. They ride out into the desert to crush Bedouin revolts, then return to feast on lamb and honey cakes in gilded halls. Their rule is tough, but undeniably splendid. Yet shadows creep closer. By the late 15th century, Portuguese explorers opened direct sea routes to India, siphoning away Egypt's lucrative spice trade. Suddenly, the Great Bazaar of Cairo isn't the only game in town. At the same time, the Ottoman Turks rise to power in Anatolia, pushing steadily closer. The end comes in 1517, when Sultan Selim I of the Ottomans marches into Egypt. At Redania, near Cairo, the Ottoman cannons thunder, and the Mamluks' cavalry charges are shredded. You can almost feel the shock in the streets of Cairo as Ottoman troops pour in. The last Mamluk Sultan, Tumen Bey, is executed, and Egypt is folded into the Ottoman Empire. Quirky aftermath. Even after conquest, Mamluks don't disappear. They continue as powerful local elites, sometimes rebelling, sometimes cooperating, always lurking in the background. Egypt becomes an Ottoman province, but the Mamluk spirit refuses to die, like a cat that keeps showing up no matter how many times you shoo it away. So now Egypt has traded one master for another. The pharaohs are long gone, the Fatimids are memories, and the Mamluks have been humbled. The Ottomans plant their crescent banners, install governors, and begin a rule that will last for centuries. You lean against a stone wall in Cairo, hearing the call to prayer mingle with the rattle of soldiers' drums, and wonder how many more empires the Nile will carry before it finally rests. You drift with the Nile into a quieter, slower rhythm as Egypt settles under Ottoman control. The year is 1517. The crescent banners of Sultan Selim I flutter over Cairo, and technically, Egypt is now just one more province in the sprawling Ottoman Empire. But if you wander the streets, you notice something odd. The Ottomans are in charge on paper, yet the Mamluks, the so-called slave soldiers you thought were defeated, still strut through Cairo's alleys, wielding influence like old ghosts who refuse to leave the party. The mainstream fact here is simple. Egypt remains under Ottoman rule for more than 300 years, until the dawn of the 19th century. That's longer than the United States has even existed. But unlike Istanbul or Damascus, Cairo never quite fades into insignificance. Instead, it hums as a cultural and religious hub, home to Al-Azhar University, where scholars debate Islamic law, astronomy, and philosophy. You picture students hunched over manuscripts by candlelight, reciting texts in rhythmic Arabic tones, while cats curl up in the corners. Of course, not everything is intellectual serenity. Egypt, under the Ottomans, is a place of uneasy balance. Officially, Ottoman governors, called pashas, are sent from Istanbul to run things. In reality, the Mamluks keep clawing their way back into power. You catch sight of them riding horses with jeweled bridles, extorting taxes, and whispering alliances. Historians still argue whether the Ottomans deliberately tolerated this Mamluk shadow power to avoid costly rebellions, or whether the sultans in far-off Istanbul simply lost interest in micromanaging Egypt. Quirky tidbit: Cairo, even in Ottoman times, loves coffee. By the 16th century, coffee houses sprout across the city, buzzing with chatter, music, and the smell of roasted beans. You slip into one, sip the bitter brew, and overhear gossip about politics, poetry, and the latest caravan arrivals. Imagine, people were once arrested for drinking coffee here, because authorities feared caffeine-fueled gatherings would spark rebellion. Yes, apparently a cup of joe was considered subversive, but not all is cozy cafes and scholarly debates. Egypt feels the tremors of empire in decline. By the 17th century, the Ottomans weaken, their military reforms lagging, their treasury drained. Egypt's governors grow more corrupt, local uprisings flare, and the economy sags as global trade routes shift firmly to European control. The once thriving Red Sea trade that fattened Cairo's market shrivels. You walk through half-empty bazaars, merchants grumbling as Portuguese ships sail past the Cape of Good Hope, leaving Egypt to sulk in the dust. And yet, the land itself never loses its magnetism. European travelers, scholars, priests, and curious nobles sneak into Egypt, dazzled by its ruins. They sketch the pyramids, write flowery descriptions of the Sphinx, and cart home antiquities. Egypt becomes a playground for European imaginations, even before colonization officially begins. You roll your eyes as some gentleman in a powdered wig insists he understands the mysteries of the Nile after a 2-week visit. Sure, buddy. Meanwhile, plague and famine continue to stalk the land. The Black Death doesn't vanish. It revisits in waves, sometimes killing tens of thousands in Cairo alone. You picture shuttered houses, silence in the streets, and the sense that Egypt is caught in a cycle of grandeur and suffering. Somehow, the people endure, planting their crops along the Nile, celebrating festivals, and telling stories under the desert stars. By the late 18th century, a storm brews on the horizon. The Ottomans are weak, the Mamluks are bickering, and Europe has grown bold. Napoleon Bonaparte, short, ambitious, and craving headlines, sets his sights on Egypt. In 1798, French ships appear off Alexandria. Imagine the shock. The French army storming into Cairo, declaring themselves liberators, while also dragging along scientists, artists, and surveyors to poke at temples and measure pyramids. That invasion is short-lived. The British swoop in and kick the French back out, but it marks a turning point. Egypt is no longer just a sleepy Ottoman province. It's a prize, a gateway to India, a symbol of prestige. Everyone wants a piece of it. You stand on the banks of the Nile, watching the last French ships sail away, knowing Egypt's days of relative obscurity are ending. A new chapter looms, full of steam engines, cotton fields, and clashing empires. For now, though, Egypt under the Ottomans drifts like a tired but stubborn reed boat. The Ottomans claim authority, the Mamluks pull strings, and ordinary people endure, making the best of a world where rulers come and go, but the Nile always returns to flood and recede. You stretch out in the Cairo night, lulled by the call to prayer, the soft creak of donkey carts, and the distant laughter from a coffeehouse where, just maybe, someone is daring to order a second cup. You feel the Nile breathe in a new century as cannon smoke and foreign ambitions drift across its waters. The Ottomans still officially rule, but the truth is that Egypt has slipped through their fingers. In the early 1800s, one man rises from the chaos, a commander named Muhammad Ali, an Albanian officer in the Ottoman army who was originally sent to stabilize Egypt after Napoleon's invasion. Instead, he seizes it for himself. You watch him maneuver like a master chess player, outwitting the Ottomans, suppressing the Mamluks, and presenting himself as both loyal servant of the Sultan and undisputed master of Egypt. Mainstream fact: Muhammad Ali is remembered as the founder of modern Egypt. He reorganizes the army, introduces factories, and pushes the country into the industrial age. You hear the clang of new machines in Cairo, the clatter of cotton looms, the steady march of conscripted soldiers in uniforms instead of tribal garb. Egypt suddenly feels less like a forgotten province and more like a regional power. But Muhammad Ali is ruthless. In 1811, he invites hundreds of Mamluk leaders to a grand celebration in Cairo's citadel. They arrive in silk robes, expecting festivities, only to be ambushed in a massacre that wipes them out almost entirely. You can almost hear the clash of swords, the screams echoing off stone walls. Quirky tidbit: a few Mamluks famously escape by leaping their horses off the citadel walls. Whether that's heroic or just insane, historians still argue. Egypt under Muhammad Ali expands aggressively. His armies march into Sudan, Syria, even threaten Istanbul itself. For a brief moment, Egypt seems on the verge of eclipsing its Ottoman overlords. But European powers, Britain, France, Austria, step in, nervous about a too-strong Egypt. They pressure Muhammad Ali to scale back, and though he keeps his dynasty, his dreams of empire fade. Still, the changes he sparks ripple through the land. His descendants, the Khedives, keep ruling under Ottoman suzerainty, but act increasingly like independent monarchs. Egypt becomes entangled in global markets, exporting cotton in vast quantities. You picture endless fields of white fluff stretching across the delta. Peasants bend under the sun, British merchants rubbing their hands at the profits. By the mid-19th century, a colossal project reshapes Egypt forever: the Suez Canal. Dug between 1859 and 1869, it links the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, slicing weeks-off journeys between Europe and Asia. You stand on its banks, watching ships glide through desert sands where once only camels tread. It's a marvel of engineering and a trap. The debts from building it drag Egypt under European financial control. Historians still argue whether Egypt could have modernized on its own terms, or whether it was always doomed to be squeezed by empires hungry for its cotton and its canal. What you know is this: by 1882, Britain marches in and occupies Egypt temporarily, which of course means they don't leave for decades. Cairo fills with red-coated soldiers, and Egyptian rulers become little more than figureheads. The 20th century hums with change. Egyptians push for independence, protests fill the streets, and nationalist voices grow louder. World wars sweep across the horizon, the canal becomes a lifeline for Allied ships, and Egypt finally declares independence in 1922, though the British still linger like unwanted guests. The monarchy limps along until 1952, when army officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser topple the king. You stand in Tahrir Square, feeling the thunder of tanks, the surge of chants, and realize Egypt has entered yet another era. Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, staring down Britain, France, and Israel in the 1956 crisis. Somehow, Egypt emerges with prestige, the West humiliated. You grin at the irony: centuries of foreign control, and now Egypt reclaims one of its greatest assets. The decades that follow bring highs and lows: wars with Israel, peace treaties, authoritarian rule, waves of hope and disappointment. The Nile keeps flowing, past satellite dishes on rooftops, past high-rise apartments and ancient ruins alike. Egypt, ancient and modern, sacred and chaotic, never stops reinventing itself. And now, as you lie back and let your eyes grow heavy, you realize this river of history has carried you from the pyramids of Giza to the revolutions of Cairo. Empires rose and fell, invaders came and went, but the pulse of Egypt endures, steady as the river's eternal tide.